Yeah, I just had a bunch of questions I'd love to get your opinion on as a writer on the Book of Revelation and I suppose eschatology in general. I've been investigating a lot of end time predictions,
Yeah.
maybe the sequence of events that's very much predicted in different parts of the world, rapture, tribulation, the antichrist, etc. And I know, of course, the Book of Revelation does seem to be the main text that is referred to in the New Testament. So my first question would be, do you think a futuristic interpretation of the Book of Revelation is what John originally intended?
Okay, so that's not a straightforward question, or not a straightforward answer, I would say, because a futurist view obviously regards the book as predicting the future, prophecy understood as predictive prophecy, and then from the perspective of John in the first century, a distant prediction if you're connecting it with events in the 21st century rather than events in the first century. I say it's complicated because, of course, for John, much of it is future, but future for him and not necessarily future for us because of the time difference. So you've got to think about the perspective of the author and the perspective of the reader. So that's one complication, I think. So my kind of reading of the book, which is a fairly standard scholarly reading, is that John has a particular message to 7 early Christian congregations. You know, he's told to write and send this to the 7 churches of Asia. And so if we take that seriously, then there is a particular message that he is bidden to communicate to them. So if we see it simply as predicting events in the 21st century, or the 20th century, or the 12th century, or the 16th century, and all these have been possibilities, it loses its punch for its first recipients. Okay, so that's an important consideration. Having said that, I think most scholars would accept that the final chapters of the book are talking about the ultimate end. So the final destruction of the powers of evil and chaos, the descent of the New Jerusalem. John may well have expected these things very early, but even from the perspective of a contemporary reader, there is a climax, a culmination, which is still to take place.
Mm. I've heard a lot of futuristic scholars talk about, they do acknowledge that these 7 churches were historical, real churches in the first century. But I noticed there seems to be a big shift when we get into chapter 4, pretty much to the end of the book, when we enter into heaven and the throne room. And it seems to be, from that point on, seems to be the most interesting for end times people, because we start to go into date predicting, or maybe predicting future events. So my question would be, is there a connection between the 7 letters and the rest of the book?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And you know, sometimes scholars have proposed that the 7 letters were originally separate. I think they're integral parts, and would see them not so much as 7 letters, but as 7 prophetic messages. So the whole book is a letter presented as a, you know, when you get it, at least into the 4th verse of the first chapter, John to the 7 churches which are in Asia, grace to you and peace. That's the beginning of a letter. But I would see the connection maybe as a kind of a broadening of perspective. So you have these 7 messages, chapters 2 and 3. Within the narrative, they're dictated to John by the Son of Man on Patmos. And they're kind of, we might see them as school reports. We might see them as kind of shining the torch. So it's as if the strengths and the weaknesses, the failures of discipleship, as well as the faithful following of Christ, all that is brought under the spotlight. Okay, so before anything else happens, the churches see that they are both weak and strong, some weaker than others. And then John is caught up into heaven, and from that perspective, he sees visions, which if we take that seriously, that these are apocalyptic visions. This is an apocalypse, and that the Greek word apocalypsis means unveiling. So as if he's caught up into heaven in order that the truth about the world of his own time, the truth about the world at any time, is revealed. A veil is lifted. So from heaven, he can see a heavenly perspective on reality. And so that then sheds a light on his own congregations. And I say the bigger picture because these little churches, and they may have been, no more than about 50 people meeting together in a house, in cities which may have had, in the case of Ephesus, maybe 200,000 people. 50 people out of 200,000 people, tiny, vulnerable. And they find themselves in these visions being part of this great army of victors who are followers of the Lamb. So their understanding of themselves is broadened. They see themselves as part of this great battle between the forces of evil and the forces of good, between the dragon and the Lamb. And they can only see that because John is caught up into heaven. So I wouldn't say there's a massive disjunction, although more is being described than simply the lives of these communities. But, they see themselves on a bigger canvas. Many people have suggested that apocalypses are like abstract art. You've got to kind of stand back and look at the big picture. You get too close, you can't see anything, or it just looks muddled. But you have to kind of stand back. And, when John is caught up, the churches stand back and they see themselves caught up into this bigger reality.
Thank you. I think I heard or read somewhere that you could almost summarize the whole book within those seven individual letters. Would that be a true description?
I wouldn't say you could summarize the whole book within those sections. I think rather the whole book puts those 7 letters in a broader context. You do get hints. So you have all these promises. For one who is victorious, I will give. That we have hints, rather like little threads of the grand tapestry which is going to be woven when the visions take place. So, many of these promises are then mentioned again and then given greater clarification in visions like the New Jerusalem at the end of the book. So yeah, we get these hints, but they're often no more than hints. And we've got to see the big picture. We've got to see those other visions in order to see what the whole picture looks like.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, in particular, chapter 6 of the book of Revelation, which is the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. I know you, I think you mentioned in your book, are the 4 horses demonic powers of evil, or are they angelic powers of God bringing about judgment to the wicked? So I suppose that would be my question. Are they forces of evil, or are they forces of good from God?
Yeah, I've often struggled with this, and I find myself changing my mind. But I think the position I've come to now is these are demonic forces or chaotic forces which nonetheless have now come under the sway of the Lamb. You know, so just before this, the Lamb is seen in heaven. And it's a pretty unexpected scene because John is told that the Lion of the tribe of Judah has conquered. And you kind of expect this great Aslan to come bounding onto the scene. And then all of a sudden, John sees a lamb standing as if slaughtered. Well, slaughtered things don't normally stand. So it's kind of this juxtaposition of power and weakness. So he has a vision really of the victory of the cross. Christ has been victorious through suffering and dying. And now he takes control. And so although these forces are forces of chaos, they are paradoxically being brought under the sway of the Lamb in order that through them, almost despite them, the victory can be fully achieved, or the effects of Christ's victory can be felt, the repercussions can spread out. And I say that for two reasons. The first is that the fourth rider is identified as death, and Hades follows him. Now, towards the end of the book, both death and Hades are revealed as enemies that need to be destroyed. And so they're thrown into the lake of fire. So if that's the case with the fourth horseman, it's probably the case with those that precede. That these forces of chaos, destruction, symbolizing war and famine, these will not have the final word. The other reason I say that is that there's a striking similarity that scholars have noticed, that readers of Revelation noticed in the early centuries, between this vision of the horseman, and that the whole of chapter 6, and Jesus's final sermon in the Synoptic Gospels. So in Mark 13, so-called Little Apocalypse, he stands on the Mount of Olives, and he prepares the four disciples who were first called, Simon Peter, Andrew, James, and John. He speaks to them, and he looks beyond the situation of his passion and his death to what will subsequently happen. Some of these things would have been past events or present realities by the time people read the Gospel of Mark. But there's also a future aspect, the final coming of the Son of Man, for example. Now, within that, you have a kind of very standard Jewish early Christian apocalyptic scenario. The expectation that before the end comes, before the kingdom can be established, there will be a particular time of trial for God's people. Scholars sometimes call it the Messianic woes, which would include wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, famines, false Christs, false messiahs.
As you know, many scholars have suggested that the rider on the white horse in chapter 6 is Jesus Christ himself, because of, as you know, in chapter 19. What would be your response to that claim?
Yeah, so that's a very early reading of Revelation 6. You get it as early as the 2nd century, that this figure is either Christ, or is the victory of the gospel, or is the Holy Spirit, because the Lamb calls out, as it were, the horseman by unsealing the seals, and then as each horseman comes out, one of the four creatures cries out, "Come." So it would perhaps be a bit odd to see Christ as the figure himself. Christ calling out Christ. On the other hand, you could see a very close relationship between the two. So Christ calls out, the victory of the gospel. He sends out the apostles. He sends out the Holy Spirit. So, that's a very, very early and pervasive way of reading. You can see it right through the Middle Ages, that reading. And of course, white is a color of heaven, a color of victory. So it would be utterly appropriate. The reasons why I think there's a different interpretation we should go for is, first of all, that Revelation is full of counterfeits, figures who can persuade people that they are on the side of the Lamb, the dragon, the beast from the sea, the beast from the earth, which has two horns like a lamb, but it speaks like a dragon. Okay, so it can be taken in. Seduction is a very pervasive feature of this. So the fact that he's dressed in white may not be the deciding factor. Secondly, as I've said, the fourth rider is Death, who is one of the enemies who's destroyed at the end. So we'd have to see a sharp distinction between the first rider and the fourth, or perhaps the first rider and the other three. And the third reason is that although there's a superficial similarity between Christ riding on a white horse in chapter 19 and this figure on a white horse, there are also some significant differences. First of all, this rider has a bow in his hand. That's his weapon. In chapter 19, Christ has a sword coming out of his mouth. That's his weapon. The sword, a fiery word. He victorious through the word that he speaks. So superficially they look similar, but in the description of them there are some significant differences. And if we go back to Mark 13, Jesus says, many will come in my name saying, I am he, or there will be false Christs and false prophets. So the expectation of counterfeits would have been quite pervasive amongst the early Christians. So the idea that this might actually be a pseudo-Christ or a false Christ is not at all implausible.
I've heard also some people say that it is like the Antichrist himself. Would that be appropriate as well, do you think?
So certainly in the Middle Ages, is often identified as the Antichrist. I should perhaps say that the term Antichrist is never used in the book of Revelation, despite the impression you might get from Google. And of course, in the New Testament, the word Antichrist is used in the first letter of John, but there it's referred to multiple people. It's talking about division within a Christian community over the nature of Christ, probably over whether Christ is really fully human and whether his death is of significance. And so the author of 1 John says many antichrists have come. So there it's not used of one particular figure, but of a number of pseudo-Christians who are revealed in the letter as actually opposing Christ. Okay, so that kind of qualifies things, I think. So rather than say this is the Antichrist, I would say this is an Antichrist or a false Christ. Those titles tend to get merged. So the Antichrist gets merged with one of the beasts, who of course are mentioned in the book of Revelation. And there's some disagreement as to whether it's the first beast from the sea or the second beast from the land. But strictly speaking, Revelation doesn't talk about the Antichrist.
Thank you. I wanted to move on. I believe it's in chapter 12 and 13 of Revelation, which is the time, times, and a half a time. I believe we see that in chapter 12, and chapter 13, I believe we see the 42 months. And one of them is the 160 days. Now, I've heard a lot of futuristic interpreters refer to this as the second half of the 7-year tribulation. But I suppose if the futuristic context might not be the case here, is there some sort of background to these numbers?
Absolutely, yes. So the immediate background is the book of Daniel. And the immediate background of the book of Daniel is the prophet Jeremiah. So you kind of got to kind of work back in sequences and kind of start with Jeremiah. So Jeremiah, writing in the light of the exile to Babylon. And there's a prophecy there about the 70 years of the desolation of Jerusalem, of the exile. And therefore the expectation that the exile would end within that period. And in fact, the people did come back to the land in the same century as the exile began. But then the book of Daniel seems to reflect, in the form that we have it, a later period where, despite the fact that people were back in the land, there was fresh persecution. And in the 2nd century BC, there's persecution under the Greek king Antiochus Epiphanes, including the desolation of the temple. And in Daniel's vision, those 70 years are reinterpreted as 70 weeks of years. A week of years, 7 years. So 490 years. And then that's kind of broken up into sets of 7 years. And so then the final 7 before the restoration is itself divided. And the expectation that the period of the defilement of the temple would be half of 7, so 3.5. And so that 3.5 years, then that comes through into the book of Revelation. But now reflecting John's time rather than the author of Daniel's time. But it has the same implications that 7 is a perfect number. Half of 7 is 3.5. That a period of 3.5 years would be the expected length of the kind of final persecution of God's people and the desolation of the temple. Now, whether the temple is actually the literal temple or God's people as a temple is itself kind of ambiguous. So 3.5 years is 42 months or 1,260 days, or, and this phrase is taken directly from the book of Daniel, a time, times, and half a time. A time, 1 year, times, two years, and half a time, half a year. So all those numerical references, those time references, are really variants of this 3.5 years, this half of the final 7.
Mm. Would, thinking about the temple, would the dating of Revelation affect that interpretation? For example, if it is written under Nero, just before the temple destroyed, or if it's under Domitian in the 90s, would that maybe affect the temple understanding as well, the literal temple?
It could. So I don't think it has to, at least. I think it's possible that even before the destruction of the temple, the Christian community could think of itself as the temple. After all, the Qumran community thought itself as a kind of living temple, an alternative temple. Paul talks about the community in Corinth as God's temple. You corporately are God's temple. So, this is part of a Jewish and early Christian theological reflection going on. So it's often used as an important piece of data for dating Revelation. I'm not sure it is, in the sense that people say if the temple is symbolic, then Revelation must be written up to 70. It could be that, but I do think that early Christians could see themselves as a temple prior to that. So yeah, it's one of those pieces of evidence which is often used for the dating of Revelation, whether it's the 60s or whether it's the 90s. I'm not sure it makes a great deal of difference to the overall interpretation, but for some people it does.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I suppose speaking of Nero, I suppose the obvious question would be, we've heard about 666 for so many years, and a lot of people claim it could be Nero. I suppose my question would be, do we know how absolute that is? Or will it open?
Yeah, no, we don't. It's a hypothesis. It's a hypothesis which is built on good foundations. Although, as far as I'm aware, it's that particular identification of the number with Nero is a relatively modern discovery. It's built on the good foundation in the sense that we know that Jews engaged in a practice called gematria, whereby you correlate the numerical value of letters of the alphabet. And in a name or a word, you add together the numerical value of each of the letters in the word, and you come up with the number of that word or the number of that name. Greeks did something similar. So we know that happened. We have various examples of that, both from Jewish literature and from graffiti. There's a famous graffito in Pompeii, which plays in that. The problem is, of course, that John only gives us the end of the process. He gives us the number, and then you're going to work back and find out what the name was. Okay, so it's plausible, and I think what gives it further plausibility is the fact that there are almost certainly references to Nero elsewhere in the book. So the head of one of the heads of the beast, which has been slaughtered, killed to death, but lives, seems to be an allusion to the fear that Nero, who died by the sword, would come back from the dead, or hadn't really died, had gone off to the east and was going to raise an army and come back. So we have various hints in the book that Nero is on the mind of John when he's trying to make sense of these visions that he is describing. If that's the case, then this fits in with gematria. It presupposes that John, although he writes in Greek, is playing this numerical game in Hebrew, using the Hebrew alphabet. Okay, so if you do it in Hebrew, you take the letters of the name Nero Caesar, put them into Hebrew characters. If you go with the Greek form of Nero, which is Neron, with an N on the end, in Hebrew, that will give you 666. Now, of course, you've mentioned 616, this alternative reading that we find in a very small number of manuscripts, was referred to by Irenaeus in the 2nd century. We have a papyrus fragment which has it. That actually works quite well on the same principle, because Nero, of course, as we call him, is the Latin form without an N on the end. The numerical value of the Hebrew letter N, the nun, is 50. So if you remove 50 from 666, you end up with 616. So working in Hebrew, Nero Caesar works both for 666 and 616. There are some other scholars who say, well, actually, given that John is working in Greek, we need a Greek explanation. And that has led some people to identify the beast as Caligula, as Gaius. So in Greek, Gaius will give you 616. So that's going with the minority reading, which some scholars think is an original. And given that 666, that repetition of the number of imperfection, 7 minus 1, 6, just underscores the evil character or the imperfect character of this number.
I suppose it would be interesting that we seem to have 2 Roman emperors. No matter which way you look at it, really, would that enforce the idea that John really has the Roman Empire in the back of his mind during the whole book of Revelation?
I think so. So you also have a vision of Babylon the Great. Now, of course, Babylon has a long history. Babylon as the place of exile, Babylon as the arrogant city, the Babylonian Empire as the one of the great conquerors of God's people, and Rome comes to be seen as a new Babylon. First letter of Peter is written from Babylon, almost certainly not the historic Babylon, but from Rome. Now, the tendency to see, or the catalyst for seeing Rome as Babylon increases when Rome destroys the temple, because Babylon destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. But I think it could have started even before Rome destroyed the temple, given that Babylon was an oppressor of God's people. Babylon trampled on the land, and Rome has done the same thing. That plus these little hints that John is thinking of specific emperors, including, of course, his interpretation of the vision of Babylon seated on the 7-headed beast, that the 7 heads are both 7 mountains, or 7 hills, and 7 kings. Rome, built on 7 hills, and then an invitation to try, in some sense, and correlate these heads with specific kings or emperors. The Greek word basileus could refer to an emperor as well as a king. So, all these things together make a strong case for John seeing these visions as, in some sense, an indictment of the empire and the city of Rome. And then, of course, in the case of Nero, by the time that John writes, almost certainly Nero has persecuted Christians, albeit in the city of Rome, restricted. It's not an empire-wide persecution, but the memory of that is very rife. And decades later, you have early Christians looking back on that. When Babylon appears as a woman who is drunk on the blood of the saints, she's revealed as a prostitute and a vampire. It's a kind of shocking vision if you think about it. Here we seem to have a personification of Rome, drunk on blood.
Yeah. And then moving on slightly into the book of Revelation, we get into chapter 16, the so-called Battle of Armageddon. We see that word. I've heard a lot of futuristic interpreters say that this is a literal battle when Jesus Christ will return to defeat the antichrist. I suppose the question would be, given what we know so far, is there such a place as Armageddon, and will there really be a futuristic battle there?
So the answer, I think, is yes and no. So Armageddon seems to be derived from Megiddo, mountain, mountain of Megiddo. Megiddo is a city, obviously a famous city in the Old Testament, a strategically located city by a very narrow pass which opens up into this vast plain in the Holy Land. So it's a really strategic location, but it's not a mountain. What is the mountain of Megiddo? So some people have suggested it's the Carmel range, Mount Carmel, not very far away, a few miles away from where the city of Megiddo is. And that's a possibility. But the location itself is at the very least atmospheric. Of course, historically, it was the place of significant battles in which Israel and its kings fought against foreign enemies. So the memory of that, the kind of multiple memories associated with that as a place of battle, and of course it is, as it's a massive plain opening out from Megiddo, a perfect battleground. If you think of, that battle scene towards the end of the Lord of the Rings, this vast plain, and then and armies in kind of all directions. I mean, this is Armageddon. This is that vast plain close to the city of Megiddo. It's said that when Napoleon saw it, he said, "There's no greater battleground on earth." So, if you're going to imagine the location of the greatest of battles, the ultimate battle which will defeat the forces of evil, then the plain near Megiddo is the most obvious place to locate it. But I would hesitate to say it's a specific place on Earth, given that John's geography often seems more than terrestrial. It's actually quite difficult to locate John's geography on a map. So, places and their associations are caught up in this apocalyptic geography that he describes. And Megiddo and its plain is part of that profound mix. So all those memories caught up, and there's this vast plain, which you need for the kind of battle that's being described. Like, this is where it must happen, wherever this is. And I think in many ways it's bigger than any terrestrial map can convey. Similarly, Jerusalem, similarly the temple, similarly even Patmos, actually. Patmos just expands as it becomes the location where heaven and earth intersect.
Mm. Yeah. And I'd like to ask, in regards to the Millennial Kingdom, if I'm understanding this sequence of events from futuristic interpreters does seem to have some problems with it. It does make me wonder what the actual second coming of Jesus Christ would look like. So do you think this 1,000 years could be seen as a literal period in humankind's timeline, or should we understand it more from a atmospheric, descriptive point of view, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, the people have fought over this idea of millennium for centuries, which is kind of ironic because it's just a couple of verses really in the whole book. I think I would say, first of all, that elsewhere in the book, numbers seem to have symbolic significance. The number 7 is the obvious example. Perfect number, number associated with God, 3, plus the number associated with the created world, 4. 6, 1 less than 7, imperfection. 12, the number of the 12 tribes. And the dimensions of the holy city, the New Jerusalem, are multiples of 12, if you notice. And we also have the number 1,000, which is, it's a biblical number for a large number. If you you've got to think of something large, you think of 1,000, and then multiples of thousands. And of course, it's the square of 10. So, the number 1,000 is an appropriate number to think of a temporary, but in some sense, perfect reign. We often think of this as the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Revelation actually doesn't say that. He says that those who are raised, probably the martyrs, reign with Christ for 1,000 years. So their reign is 1,000 years, without passing any comment of how long Christ's reign is. But if we think this is a symbolic number, then there is this temporary period which breaks up the narrative of the kind of culmination of the salvation in the last few chapters, in which Satan is out of the way, evil, chaos, destruction out of the way, and we catch a glimpse of what the world looks like with Christ and his martyrs in charge. It's almost as if we get a glimpse of the kingdom of God. And then the action starts up again with the release of Satan, and then the kind of final wrapping up, the destroying of the destroyers of the earth, which culminates with the last enemy, as Paul says, to be destroyed, death and Hades being thrown into the lake of fire. And then the scene is set for the descent of the New Jerusalem. Now, seeing it in that kind of more symbolic but profoundly real way, symbolic is not necessarily unreal, will explain why some Christian readers of the book, particularly from Augustine onwards, and this was then affected the way in which Christians read this for much of the Middle Ages, sometimes connected the millennium with the New Jerusalem. And they also saw the millennium as beginning not with the resurrection of the dead, not with the final coming of Christ, but with his first coming. So from Christ coming among us, the kingdom has broken in, the millennium has begun. So for Augustine, in his later views about the millennium, this is a symbolic number describing the change in his history, the change at the heart of the cosmos, which occurred when the Word became flesh, when Christ came among us for the first time, and will be consummated at the end with his second coming.
Yes, I've often wondered, was the millennium and the new heaven and new earth sort of intertwined? Because I suppose if we took a literal approach, it almost sounds like Christ has some work to do here in this life before we transcend into heaven. I wondered.
And that instinct that you've got there, Dale, wondering whether there's more interweaving going on, that is a kind of insight which has led people, and again we find this as early as the 3rd century, wondering whether the book is written in chronological sequence, or whether actually it's more kind of cyclic. You know, John rarely says this happens and that happens. He says, I saw, and then I saw, and then I saw. So he's seeing things in some kind of visionary state. And he describes them, he's organized them in the book that he's subsequently written, in some kind of sequence, but the sequence he presents is a sequence in which he sees things, rather than the sequence in which they necessarily occur. And at times you kind of feel, well, haven't we been here before? Haven't we heard this? Or are we going back? So in chapter 12, John sees a pregnant woman who then gives birth to a male child who will rule the nations with an iron scepter. Almost every interpreter has understood that to be Christ. So, you know, we're halfway through the book, and then we've gone back to the birth of Christ. So, at times it seems that we've been presented less with a straightforward chronological sequence, and more with different ways of looking at the same reality presented to us in the sequence in which John sees them.
Yeah. I suppose I found personally someone who's investigating claims of end time predictions that really, although we may get some glimpses from the book of Revelation, I suppose we come back to Jesus's words of the Son of Man coming like a thief in the night, that there is no way really we can put any kind of sequence or calendar predictions to these events. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I think so. And of course, in the book itself, Jesus interjects, behold, I'm coming like a thief. So that same saying that we find in the Gospels reappears in the book of Revelation. And it's just kind of thrown in the middle of a chapter, just to kind of keep us on our guard. And then, of course, we have the words in the Gospel. You know, no one knows the day nor the hour, neither the Son nor the angels, but only the Father, which I guess should keep us somewhat humble.
Yeah. Just see how we're doing for time. Are we about 40 minutes in? Yeah, so, well, first of all, Ian, I'd like to thank you so much for your time. I believe I've gone through all my questions and certainly the things I've been investigating. So I'd like to thank you so much, and it is an honor to be able to speak to you, and I'll continue reading your book.
Okay, great. Yeah, it looks well fun. So, well, thank you. Sorry I lost my train of thought earlier on.
Oh, that's okay. No problem.
I forget where I was going with that, but...
was it the...
which regularly happens to me.
the millennial or messianic reign, I believe.
Messianic woes, yeah. There was another point I was going to make, and it completely escaped me. And it hasn't come back now, so...
yeah. Oh, if it was okay, Ian, I'm sorry, I did have one question, if that was okay. I hope this doesn't throw you off. Something separate. Do you think John saw what he actually saw, or is he using the Old Testament to sort of help him as a guide?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the more we know about claims of visionary experience, the more we realize how complex the process is. And so, you know, both those things happen. So I think we should give John the benefit of the doubt. And when he says, I saw, trust, unless we have any clear reason to think otherwise, that he is describing some kind of visionary experience that he received, perhaps over a long period of time. But we know from studies of visionaries in a whole range of cultures how their own tradition not only enables them to make sense of what they've seen after the event, but actually shapes the patterns that they actually see within the visionary experience itself.
Mm.
So there's a really interesting book by John Ashton on Paul, the religion of Paul the Apostle, and he's got a whole section on Paul the Visionary here, which is a really interesting kind of perspective on that. We also have some evidence from, I think from the Apocalypse, but certainly from later Jewish mystical tradition, Jewish visionaries who seem to be, at least in some sense, the successors of those who wrote the Apocalypses, that they meditated on specific passages of Scripture in preparation for their visionary experience. And the opening chapter of Ezekiel was one particular passage. And of course, there's a lot of Ezekiel in John. So I think it's quite likely that John has studied, meditated on specific passages prior to visionary experience. Some of those patterns then come to play in what he describes, what he sees, although often in a rather fluid way, which seems to count against him just engaging in literary borrowing. And then, of course, you know, the book is then the result of a further process of having seen these things, reflecting on them and putting them down in a literary work. And so at every stage, the influence of the Old Testament can come into play, whether through actual text, whether it's through memory, whether it's making his own translation, whether it's all those things happening simultaneously. So I think it's a complicated question, but I think we can take both of those elements seriously, given what we know about how visionary experience functions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ian, once again. It is wonderful to meet you, and thank you for your time.
Well, no, delighted to meet you as well, Dale. And Simon Woodman was a teacher of yours, so.
Yes, he was my biblical studies tutor at university in Cardiff. I have also interviewed him. He has authored a core textbook on Revelation. Yeah,
it's a great book.
Yeah,
and he's a great colleague. So if you're speaking to him again, then pass on my best wishes to him.
Will do. Yes, I think I will do.
Is he in London still? Well,
yes, he's at Bloomsbury. Yes, Bloomsbury Baptist Church. Yes, I think they're doing everything pretty much online at the moment. But yes, he's been there for a good 8 years, I believe now.
Really? Gosh. Mind you, I've been over here 7 years, so time flies.
Yes. And do you lecture in biblical studies, Ian?
Yeah, New Testament specifically. Yeah. So, but I'm doing all classes online at the moment, so.
Yes, yeah.
So we switched halfway through the last semester, and then this semester, so we started again. We're now 5 weeks into classes. We started back in August, so it's kind of going okay. I was a bit worried about how it would be forming classes online.
Yes.
These last semester we started in the classroom and then we switched.
Yes.
But it seems to have been okay. Of course, you can't always tell. You can only see so many people on the screen, and then you start showing a PowerPoint, then a lot of them disappear.
Yes.
Turn the cameras off. But it seems to be going well.
Oh, good. Lovely.
Okay, I wish you well with this production. So, how are you getting on with filming things?
Very well. I've done 4 interviews so far with different scholars and
Yeah.
editing those together. Yes, I'm hoping a month or 2, hopefully less, we should have completion. I'm also a musician, so I'm doing music for it as well, which is a lot of fun.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, have a great day, Ian, and
Okay, Dale. Good to talk to you.
you too. Thank you so much.
Nice to meet you.
And you too.
Okay.